The state of New Hampshire's Atlantic coast, from the Isles of Shoals and sandy Hampton Beach, to the city of Portsmouth and its revolutionary ties to Boston in the south. One of New Hampshire's best-kept secrets.
The Isles of Shoals are close to the richest fishing grounds in maybe the world.
Exploring New Hampshire's role in the American Revolution.
Up until the last minute, until a guy named Paul Revere showed up, we were kind of happy being British.
And touching down along New England's most historic monuments to freedom.
This idea of United States comes out of the bloodshed that was on this hill.
Now, 50,000 kilometers of eastern coastline are revealed from above. An aerial journey over America's rugged Atlantic frontier. This is America over the edge. The state of New Hampshire boasts the shortest saltwater shoreline of any American state. It stretches from Maine's border in the north to Massachusetts in the south, and marks the only place in America where an entire state's coast can be seen from above. New Hampshire's mainland coast measures just 21 kilometers of stunning shoreline. But from the sky, an offshore stretch of coast can also be seen. Just south of the 43rd parallel, the Isles of Shoals sit directly on the invisible marine boundary dividing New Hampshire from the state of Maine. They have been a popular vacation destination for New Hampshire residents since 1897, and a fishing outpost centuries before that.
The Isles of Shoals are 9 islands, about 6 miles off the coast here from Rye. There are 4 of them in New Hampshire and 5 in the state of Maine. There was a town out there in the colonial times, a fishing community. In the broadest sense, they're the most picturesque islands, definitely, in New Hampshire.
The islands also mark one of the earliest settlements for Europeans in the region. The first township here was known as Appledore and encompassed all the islands. Over time, residents gradually moved to Star Island on the New Hampshire side of the state line. And from the air, it is clear to see how the islands got their title, named for the rocky ledges surrounding these barren islands.
The Isles of Shoals are close to the richest fishing grounds in maybe the world, but definitely in this region. That brought fishermen from European countries, Norway, England. All of them came here, and they come early on, even before the colonists came to the United States.
Sue Reynolds has worked the waters off New Hampshire her whole life. Now she sails out of Rye Harbor, sharing the Isles of Shoals with the world.
We're in Rye Harbor right now. We're headed through the breakwaters that are just ahead of us, out into the Gulf of Maine. Then we'll head out to the Isles of Shoals.
The islands today are a mix of scientific research and recreation.
There's Shoals Marine Lab on Appledore Island, the largest of the islands. It's about 95 acres in size. Shoals Lab is jointly run by Cornell University and the University of New Hampshire. Then there's Star Island. That's where the town was historically.
Today, Star Island is owned by the Star Island Corporation, a group aimed at preserving this island and its magnificent historic hotel built in 1873.
The left side of that building is a marine lab with displays of
This is one of the last standing wood frame Victorian hotels on the seacoast of New Hampshire. This one is still in its pretty much, it's got some modern things like you will see solar panels as we go around and things. It's updated a lot, but inside the hotel and the outside is pretty much kept in its Victorian sense. And in that way, it just appears like stepping back into history.
But beyond the hotel that dominates much of the island, secrets of the past can be found.
And now we're at the Gosport Chapel. This is on the highest point of Star Island. It was originally a wood frame chapel. It was built from timbers from a Spanish shipwreck. And then at the end of one really cold winter in the late 1700s, the residents of Gosport, fishermen mostly, were so cold that they took their chapel wood and they burned it piece by piece for warmth for the rest of the winter. Missionary groups came along on the mainland and they said the people out at Gosport need a place that could be their meeting house or maybe their school or maybe their first aid station or their town hall. So missionary groups on the mainland built this chapel in 1800.
And beyond the chapel, a memorial to one of the European founders of this region, who arrived more than 400 years ago.
This is the John Smith Memorial in memory of Captain John Smith, who came up here in 1614 and charted and mapped the whole area. He was the first one to coin the name New England. When he got to these islands, he loved them so much that he named them after himself on his charts, calling them the Smith Isles.
Finally, the Isles of Shoals feature a coastal landmark that Sue Reynolds has seen from afar since she was a child. A few years ago, she personally took the lead in preserving this offshore piece of history.
Finally, the last stop of our Star Island tour is the perfect view of White Island Lighthouse Station. White Island Lighthouse Station was built in 1820. In 1986, the Coast Guard automated most lighthouse stations, including White Island. And when it was automated, that meant that no one had to live over there anymore, and that meant that no one was caring for the lighthouse. A group of kids where I was teaching in Northampton started a nonprofit, Lighthouse Kids. It blossomed and blossomed. Now there are stewards out there working on White Island, adult lighthouse kids, stewards who work painting, cleaning, fixing, and doing minor repairs. This lighthouse is important to me because as a child I spent time on the beach in the New Hampshire seacoast and could look out here and never get here on my own. I love the Isles of Shoals, I love White Island Lighthouse Station and all other lighthouses.
Back on shore, the mainland Maine-New Hampshire boundary is also marked by water. The Piscataqua River separates the town of Kittery in the north from the city of Portsmouth in the south. New Hampshire has been called the mother of all rivers, with 40 rivers flowing more than 65,000 kilometers down from the granite mountains of the interior. And from high above, heading down the Piscataqua River, past the Piscataqua River Bridge. the city of Portsmouth is revealed. Established in 1623, Portsmouth is the oldest city in New Hampshire. And locals say it is the third oldest city in the United States. From the air, a mix of incredible architecture is revealed. Colonial, Georgian, and Federal-style houses, cobblestone streets, and historic attractions like Prescott Park, and the dozens of restored period homes that make up the outdoor museum known as Strawberry Bank. On the water, the maritime legacy of Portsmouth is showcased on Seavey Island. Here, the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard marks one of the oldest working ports in the United States. It has produced some of America's most impressive ships of war, including the USS Albacore in 1953, the fastest submarine of its time. At the opposite end of Seavey Island, the Portsmouth Naval Prison is one of the most dominant structures visible from the waterfront. Beginning in 1908, this became known as Alcatraz of the East.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen, all for free. No subscription required.
Housing 86,000 naval and marine convicts over 66 years, until the facility closed in 1974. But the military legacy of Seavey Island goes back even further, with this island site used as a training ground for the New Hampshire militia in the 1770s. It's all part of a rich and complicated legacy, linking Portsmouth to the earliest moments of the American Revolution.
So the people of Portsmouth were really kind of on the edge in terms of the American Revolution. A good portion of the people of Portsmouth, because we were friendly with the king, actually didn't want a revolution. And things happened very slowly here in terms of building up the American Revolution. All the action was happening maybe down the Boston area. Up until the last minute, until a guy named Paul Revere showed up, we were kind of happy being British.
J. Dennis Robinson says that while history links the beginning of the Revolution with Paul Revere's ride to Lexington, Massachusetts, residents of Portsmouth say the real ride happened here, December 13, 1774, 6 months before the Revolution began.
So Paul Revere comes running into town, riding into town, and he starts getting everybody all excited by telling them that the British are coming to the fort, Fort William and Mary, to remove the munitions, to remove the gunpowder, or to lock it up so that the colonists can't get a hold of it. Now the locals in the Committee of Safety get a little crazy, and the next morning they're beating the fife and the drum, and 400 people from the Portsmouth and surrounding areas come by boat to the island, and they actually raid Fort William and Mary. They actually, I mean, this would be like us going to the Pentagon today and taking over the Pentagon. It's the king's fort, the king's gunpowder, and we're stealing it.
From inside the modern-day fort site, Robinson describes this defining moment.
So you can imagine this is where the soldiers, the poor sick soldiers, were protecting the fort from what ended up being 400 men and actually some women attacking from Portsmouth. They weren't patriots yet because there's no battle, there's no American Revolution yet. They're just getting the gunpowder before the British prevent us from having access to the gunpowder. The problem was that there was legislation being passed in Parliament that said that we weren't going to have access to gunpowder anymore. So people knew that there was something brewing. had anyone been killed, this probably, historically, would have been the beginning of the American Revolution. Shots were fired, but perhaps maybe in the air because everybody knew everybody. The result was that 100 kegs of gunpowder were taken away, hidden in various towns around here, and we think that gunpowder ended up at Bunker Hill, at the Battle of Bunker Hill.
Next, from the air and heading for the center of town, this Portsmouth landmark is the only home in America connected to John Paul Jones.
We're in the John Paul Jones house, named for John Paul Jones, not an American, he was from Scotland. This house is actually 1758, actually built by a housewright who was African-American, who actually designed it. It was owned by a niece of the royal governor, but her husband, Gregory Purcell, died, leaving her with 8 or 9 children that she had to support. So she had to take in tenants, we believe. And one of the first tenants she took in 1777, was John Paul Jones. So his room, we think, is up the stairs.
Here, Robinson recalls the legacy of a figure he believes to be one of America's most controversial heroes.
So here we are upstairs. We believe that John Paul Jones, when he was staying here, and he may have stayed here twice, stayed in this room right over here. Okay, we're in John Paul Jones's bedroom, we think. He had come to America. The strange thing is, although he's often called the father of the American Navy, he wasn't really in the American Navy because it hadn't been formed yet. He was in the Continental Navy. He wasn't a father because he had no children, and his name wasn't John Paul Jones. It was John Paul. He got assigned to take the ship Ranger out of Portsmouth, which was being built here. But he was a captain who wanted to change the world, and he ended up heading out in the Ranger with maybe the flag over there, that's what we call the Ranger flag. We don't know where that came from, but there's this strange American flag that was first used. And he went to England, basically trying to get some prisoners to trade for prisoners of war. But it was a very, very bold move. It freaked the British out, and he actually succeeded in taking down the Drake. It was a very big deal. He met Franklin over there and eventually got a second ship, the Bonhomme Richard, caused even more wild damage by taking down a British warship, and ended up actually back here in 1782 to get the tall ship America, which was basically the largest warship built in America at the time. Unfortunately, we gave that ship to the French. Jones left kind of in disgrace. He ended up fighting for the Tsar of Russia. He died in France, was buried, dug up 114 years later, brought to Annapolis, and that's the story that we honor him, basically in the only museum in America that honors him as the John Paul Jones House.
Finally, back to the waterfront, Robinson completes the tour at the Portsmouth Harbor Light. It is the third light that has stood here, helping historians like Robinson reveal the complicated moments and characters of Portsmouth's past.
No tour of the Piscataqua region is complete without this scenic shot of Portsmouth Harbor Light. So the lighthouse is really a great symbol of what we're trying to do here. I mean, it's the truth about American history that happened here in the battle, that happened with John Paul Jones. What we're trying to do in the Piscataqua region is tell the real story of America. We have a lot of myths, we have a lot of stories that aren't really all that accurate. A lot of it is tricky and hard to tell. So our goal with heritage tourism here is to tell the full story, because I think that the more we tell our story honestly and truthfully, the better Americans we become.
While the islands off the coast of New Hampshire are rich in beauty, and the coastal city of Portsmouth is steeped in history, The New Hampshire interior is a world unto its own. Heading west towards the interior, the Piscataqua River and Oyster River lead to a settlement once known as Oyster River Plantation. Today, it is known as Durham. Durham was settled in the 1630s by early New Hampshire residents seeking fresh water, fertile fields, and access to the waters of the Atlantic. Today, the town is home to 14,000 people and may be best known as a campus town for the University of New Hampshire. Further inland, civilization is left behind on approach to the foliage and fall colors of Pawtuckaway State Park. The park covers 5,000 acres, part of the northeastern coastal forests ecoregion. And from above, New Hampshire's rich forests can truly be appreciated. Vast tracts of pine, hemlock, maple, and elm. The trees stretch as far as the eye can see. In contrast to New Hampshire's tiny coasts, forests here cover 4.8 million acres, more than 80% of the entire state. Pawtuckaway State Park takes its name from nearby Pawtuckaway Lake and the Pawtuckaway Mountains, a rugged ring of volcanic rock more than 110 million years old. Next, 60 kilometers northwest of Portsmouth, civilization returns along the contours of the Merrimack River. The city of Concord began as a small settlement in the early 18th century, but quickly grew in prominence with the construction of a canal and lock system linking it to Boston. Shortly after, in 1808, Concord was named the capital of New Hampshire. And from the sky, it is clear it remains one of America's smallest and most historic state capitals. Concord's Capitol building was constructed in 1810 and is the oldest capitol in America where the state's legislative branches still meet in their original chambers. And just to the north on Rattlesnake Hill, a symbol of the city and the region, can be best experienced from high above. In addition to being known as Mother of all rivers, New Hampshire is also known as the Granite State. And granite has been a key resource here dating back to the late 1800s. Concord granite from quarries in these hills quickly became known for its texture and quality. Today, stone from Rattlesnake Hill can be found in the Library of Congress, the Pentagon, and the Brooklyn Bridge. Finally, 20 kilometers further northwest, the hills continue to rise as Lake Winnipocket leads to the vast expanse of Winslow State Park. Winslow State Park is named after a 19th century hotel, Winslow House, that once stood here. Located on the northwest slope of Mount Kearsarge, the park may be best known for its views of White Mountain National Forest. The White Mountains cover roughly 1/4 of the entire state of New Hampshire. And from above, this vast expanse of hills can be seen. The White Mountains are one of the most popular tourist attractions in New Hampshire, highlighted by Mount Washington, the highest peak in the northeastern United States. Back to Portsmouth and the coast. The Piscataqua River meets the Atlantic Ocean at Odiorn Point State Park. And here, from high above, all of New Hampshire's Atlantic shoreline can be seen. The state's geography can be traced back to New Hampshire's original charter in 1622, when Captain John Mason and Sir Ferdinando Gorges were granted lands between the Kennebec and Merrimack rivers. The two later divided the grant, choosing the Piscataqua as the northern limit for John Mason's half, which would be called New Hampshire. More than a century later, the southern border with Massachusetts was settled, leaving the 21 kilometers of New Hampshire coast that exists today, the shortest coastline of any state in America. But centuries later, that tiny coast has flourished. South of Rye Harbor, Genesee Beach is one of 6 public beaches lining New Hampshire's coastal Route 1. These beaches are known as some of the best along the East Coast. Of the 35 American beaches dubbed superstar beaches by the Natural Resources Defense Council, 3 of them are found along New Hampshire's tiny stretch of shoreline. Further south, incredible mansions and summer homes line the horizon. Amazingly, these secluded, quiet neighborhoods are just a stone's throw from the state's most famous seaside attraction, Hampton Beach. Hampton Beach makes up more than 10% of New Hampshire's coast and has been attracting hundreds of thousands of visitors each year for more than a century. Its Ocean Boulevard and boardwalk offer recreation and entertainment throughout the summer months. And beyond Hampton Harbor Inlet, Seabrook Beach stretches even further, a spectacular sandy landscape that leads to the state line as New Hampshire meets Massachusetts. South of the state line, a similar landscape continues, with more elaborate coastal residences lining Massachusetts Bay. In fact, although New Hampshire was established in 1629, it was ruled by Massachusetts governors until 1741. The two states share a common landscape and history. And one of the most fascinating chapters in that history can be found 40 kilometers south of the state line, in the city of Salem. Salem is best known for its trials of 1692, when a Puritan establishment and a tense period in the region led to hundreds of residents being suspected of witchcraft.
So in 1692, the witch trials began with the usual suspects. Witchcraft was usually kind of considered a working class crime where, usually people who were different for some reason, poor beggars, people who were slightly addled, perhaps might have today what we consider to be mental illness, people who were particularly problematic or nettlesome neighbors. Anybody who wasn't typical or normal might be seen as a possible witch.
What made Salem different was a mass hysteria that spread through the region, even implicating the highest members of society. A panel of 9 judges presided at Salem's trials. But amazingly, they accepted a form of proof known as spectral evidence, meaning someone's spirit could have committed a crime without them physically being there.
The trials themselves lasted a little over a year. By the time they were done, the jails of Massachusetts were full with over 150 people being tried. There were 4 sets of executions throughout the summer and fall of 1692 with 19 people executed, and is really one of the great American tragedies.
In the heart of downtown Salem, the Charter Street Cemetery holds the remains of many involved with the trials.
We don't know where the victims were buried, certainly not here, but we do know that some of the judges and other of the leading figures of Salem of the day all lay at peace here. So here we have the stone of Colonel John Haythorne. He was one of the 9 witchcraft judges in 1692, and he's also famous as the direct ancestor of the author Nathaniel Hawthorne. And here we have the tomb of the Gedney family. Bartholomew Gedney was another witchcraft judge, and he's buried in this tomb with other members of his family. The judges were amongst the leading citizens of the town, wealthy merchants, leading politicians, and they have very fancy tombs which survive to this day. And here, hidden in the corner of the cemetery, a stone that not many people realize is here. Here's the stone to Nathaniel Mather. He's the son of Increase Mather and Cotton Mather. The Mathers were the leading ministers of the colony, and Nathaniel and Increase were very much involved in the witch trial proceedings in 1692. A beautiful death's head stone, very typical of Puritan art of the day.
And with no clue to the location of the victims' remains, a memorial stands next to the cemetery.
So in the heart of Salem, there is a memorial to the victims of the witch trials of 1692. It's a very simple granite memorial with benches to reflect upon the events of that year and the victims. And there's 1 bench to each of the victims. Here's the first woman executed, Bridget Bishop, who was hanged on June 10th, 1692. A little over a month later, 4 more victims were executed after their trials. We happen to be at that anniversary today, July 19th. Here we are on July 19th in Salem. Sarah Good was one of 5 victims executed that day. She was believed to be a somewhat addled woman, also a pauper, and was kind of the typical sort of victim that was originally singled out for witchcraft. Elizabeth Howe hanged the same day. Susanna Martin, all the way from Amesbury, who lived about 20 miles north of here. The Salem witch trials didn't just take place in Salem. They were really sort of a colony-wide phenomenon with the web of accusations spreading ever further outward. Here's the bench to Rebecca Nurse, hanged on July 19th. Rebecca Nurse was the first victim who really raised eyebrows because she was considered to be a saintly grandmother. She was a devout Puritan, a beloved figure, that no one could really believe she was a witch. But when she was accused and convicted of witchcraft, people began to realize that no one was safe from the outbreak of witchcraft in Salem. And look at this, people come and put offerings on this bench. You'll see here a little offering put into the stone wall. Oftentimes there'll be flowers on these benches by descendants, because there are literally hundreds of thousands of descendants of the victims, of course, alive today.
Emerson Baker has studied the Salem witch trials for years. While he says they are an unimaginable tragedy in American history, they do hold a message for today's world.
I really see the Salem witch trials as a turning point in American history. The witch trials really sort of breaks the faith that the Massachusetts people have in their theocracy, in their government, and it really is the beginning of that division of church and state, an important principle today. Salem really is an important lesson for us to learn. It's a case where people rush to judgment, where people tended to scapegoat others with the term witch trial or a witch hunt, synonymous with Salem. I mean, we tend to think that we're a lot smarter and wiser today than we were in 1692, but imagine this. In 1692, we know witches are real. We know they can kill our families, destroy our homes, and they don't even have to be present to do it. They can be many miles away. Imagine this too, we don't really know who they are. Anybody can be a witch, and our government is almost powerless to try to root them out. But we look for people who might be a little different. Perhaps they worship God a little bit differently than we do. Perhaps they dress a little differently or speak with an accent. Well, if you swap the word terrorist for witch, I think you understand the predicament the people of Salem faced in 1692.
On the shores of Massachusetts Bay, above the city of Salem, the skyline of Boston can be clearly seen. Boston is the capital of Massachusetts and is home to world-famous landmarks, top-notch universities, and an incredible history. From above, Boston's monuments to history can be seen clearly, standing side by side with the tallest modern buildings in New England. And if the inciting incidents of the American Revolution took place in Portsmouth to the north, many of the battles that followed were played out here, far below.
The Freedom Trail consists of 16 sites, and most of them are involved in the American Revolution. Now, we also have some that were involved in the Civil War and other points of Boston history, but the primary focus is the American Revolution.
Amazingly, many buildings, monuments, and key moments of the Revolution can be experienced on a short walk through this historic downtown.
One of the most popular historical sites in Boston is the Old South Meeting House. There were so many fiery speeches and events that happened here, but the most famous one is the meeting about the Boston Tea Party.
This is the Old South Meeting House. It was built in 1729 as a Puritan meeting house. This was the actual place where the Boston Tea Party started, where most of the huge revolutionary protests that took place in Boston started. On the night of December 16th, which is when the Boston Tea Party started, it was packed to the rafters. Every single space in the building had a person in it. There were over 5,000 people here for that meeting. It's astounding. Remember, Boston's only 15,000 people. So this is not just people from Boston, it's people from surrounding areas as well. And they're all here to decide what to do about this tax on tea. And the decision of the meeting, everybody knows, was not to land the tea. And they found a creative way to refuse the tea. They dumped it overboard in what's become known today as the Boston Tea Party. But think about it, 5,000 people were part of that decision. That's pretty amazing.
Just a kilometer to the north, another historic building and another key moment in the Revolution.
So we've now entered the North End. And we're about to approach the Old North Church, which is properly known as Christ Church, and it's where the lanterns were hung during Paul Revere's midnight ride.
We're sitting in the balcony of the historic Old North Church. This is Boston's oldest church building, built in 1723. We're famous for our activity at the beginning of the American Revolution.
Old North Church was unique, as most Anglican churches of the era would have supported the British Crown. But loyalty here was divided, and in the early moments of the Revolution, members of this church would unknowingly make history.
The most famous moment in this church's history was on April 18th, 1775. That evening, one of the vestry members, Captain John Pulling, along with the church sexton, Robert Newman, climbed into the steeple at dusk. They took 2 lanterns with them. Those lanterns were a signal to the Sons of Liberty in Charlestown. It signified that British troops would be marching that night to Lexington and Concord, taking the shorter route by rowing across the Charles River to Cambridge. The lanterns were held aloft for about a minute. Dozens of riders were sent out from Charlestown immediately. The most famous of the riders, Paul Revere, made it out to Lexington that night to deliver warning to Sam Adams and John Hancock that the British were marching to capture them. The story about the hanging of the lanterns was not nationally known until 1860. That's when Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, a local poet, friend of the abolitionist cause, wrote the poem Paul Revere's Ride. Longfellow was using the symbol of Paul Revere streaking across the countryside to encourage young men to join the Union Army to save their nation and to free slaves in the American South. He used the image of 2 lights streaming from a church steeple to assert that God had blessed the American cause of freedom, both freeing ourselves from the British in the Revolutionary War, but also freeing slaves in the American South in the Civil War that would begin just a few months after the poem was published. And that is the real message that we want people to understand when they come see Old North Church and they remember that stirring line, 1 if by land and 2 if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be.
Finally, the last stop on the Freedom Trail is a memorial to one of the war's key battles.
We're at a unique place in Boston. This is one of the first monuments built to honor the American Revolution, not a specific individual, but actually the movement as a whole and all the people who fought and sacrificed their lives here.
And those people were a group of inexperienced colonial soldiers who had successfully cut off supply lines to the city. 5,000 British soldiers were essentially stuck in Boston, though city residents suffered as well. The British tried to lure the colonists to the hills north and south of the city, but the colonists got wind of their plans. They sent a new provincial army to Bunker Hill and nearby Breeds Hill. They were now in cannon range of British forces.
So when the British troops wake up first thing in the morning on June 17th, they see a fortification on this hill. They know they have to remove it. They have to wait for the tides to behave, but finally the British troops make their way up to Charlestown around 2 o'clock in the afternoon on June 17th. But by that point, the colonists here have fortified not only this hill, but they've dug breastworks and rail fences and stone walls covering all the way to the Mystic River. So this is a completely fortified hill.
The battle was fierce, and while the British won, it took 3 separate attacks in what should have been a simple fight.
So this is a victory for the British troops, but it's also a loss for them. Out of 2,200 soldiers who took part in this battle, 1,054 were killed or wounded in less than 2 hours' time. So it's a true Pyrrhic victory. The colonists, out of about 4,000 troops here, suffer roughly 400 troops killed, wounded, and captured. So the colonists lose the hill, but they actually have a moral victory instead. They prove that they can fight and inflict a lot of damage on this army.
The Battle of Bunker Hill left the British Army badly damaged. Centuries later, the Bunker Hill National Monument is a testament to this important chapter in American history.
So the first monument comes to this hill in 1794. It was 18 feet tall, made of wood, but it starts to fall apart as wood does. So in 1823, the Bunker Hill Monument Association is formed, and they want to place a more permanent monument on this spot to honor all the men who fought here. So they start construction in 1825, and the monument's completed in 1842. It's still here today. It's 221 feet and 5 inches tall, and it has 294 stairs if you're brave enough to try and climb all the way to the top, where you'll have one of the best views in the entire city of Boston.
For Jessica Pilkington and Chelsea Ruscio, the buildings and monuments along the Freedom Trail are a remarkable piece of American history, preserved in the heart of one of America's great cities.
What strikes me the more I read about this is leading up to the Battle of Bunker Hill, these men who came to fight were fighting for their rights as British subjects. They didn't want to be treated like second-class citizens anymore. That's how they felt. But it's this battle, what takes place on this hill, that changes things. This is the battle where they start thinking, we don't want to be treated as British subjects anymore. We can be our own new country. We can do this all of ourselves. We don't need a king in order to tell us what to do. We don't need Parliament to pass laws on us when we have the ability and a Congress to do it ourselves. And so what I love about this site is that this American feeling, this idea of United States, comes out of the bloodshed that was on this hill. This is really where this idea of a United States is born.
The Freedom Trail really belongs to the people of Boston, and there are all sorts of people who help maintain it, who help share it with tourists. I work for the Freedom Trail Foundation, and we have over 40 tour guides who give various tours of the Freedom Trail. We cover the first half of the Freedom Trail, which is from the Boston Common to Faneuil Hall. We cover the north end. We do pretty much everything. But there are also people who give tours running along the Freedom Trail, on segways. You have people at different historical sites. We really all work together to share it with the people who visit Boston. I've lived in Boston for 10 years now, and when I first moved here, I was walking by these historical buildings every single day, and I had no idea what they had to do with the Revolution, with Boston's history. I was just so focused on being in school and doing that. But after I graduated and I started working here in the heart of the city, I really fell in love with the city's history, and I really love sharing it with everyone who comes to visit.
From the historic city of Portsmouth, to the stunning Isles of Shoals, to the incredible forests of the interior and sandy beaches of the Atlantic. The coastal region of New Hampshire is a hidden gem lining America's eastern seaboard. This region is steeped in history, from the Abenaki Native Americans to the earliest European settlers. To the legendary figures of the American Revolution. The nation's shortest coastline reveals the birth of a nation. Here, on the edge of America,